Good morning and happy St. Patrick's Day from the Port of Los Angeles. I'm Philip Sandfield, the Port's Communications Director. Leading today's briefing, as always, is Port of Los Angeles Executive Director Gene Soroka. Greetings, Gene.
Hello, Philip, and top of the morning to everyone. We're coming to you late this week on St. Patty's Day because I just returned from a trade mission to Japan. I'll share all the news from that journey in just a few moments, but first, Philip, back to you for an overview of today's agenda.
Thanks. Let's start this morning with cargo data, then take a look upstream, and as always, we'll answer questions from journalists. So at our last briefing, you mentioned that we'd see a significant volume decline in February. Where do we land?
Philip, from a pure numbers perspective, the decline was indeed steep. We moved just 488,000 container units in February. That's the fewest since March of 2020. For context, Los Angeles handled 61 container vessels last month versus 93 a year ago. We also saw 30 canceled sailings here, again reminiscent of what we experienced during the early days of the pandemic. When compared to last February, which was our best ever, the overall TEU decrease was a stark 43%. And in contrast to our 5-year February average, we were down by nearly a third. Not surprisingly, we saw declines across the board. Imports landed at 249,000 TEUs, about 41% less than last year. Exports closed at 82,000 TEUs, which was a 14% year-on-year decline. And we processed just 156,000 empties, less than half compared to a year ago.
Gene, you mentioned we're seeing numbers similar to early 2020. What factors are putting the brakes on trade?
Philip, first and foremost, this is a global phenomenon. We may not be at the height of the pandemic, but there are more container vessels sitting idle around the world today than at any time since it began. And spot container rates have declined to nearly 3-year lows. Why? The demand is just not there. And that leads to my second point. U.S. warehouses remain largely full. Retailers must clear inventory levels before the next wave of imports arrive. But with the economy on everyone's mind and consumers continuing to feel the pinch of inflation, older inventories are simply not moving fast enough. Third, this past Lunar New Year packed a harder punch than usual. Factories were closed longer and orders were weaker overall. Because Lunar New Year hits the calendar differently each year, overall first quarter data gives a truer picture of the market than just a monthly comparison. That said, the first quarter will be soft, likely down a third over last year and 21% below our 5-year average. And in addition to those macroeconomic factors, here on the West Coast, we're still dealing with the effects of the ongoing longshore labor negotiations. Cargo owners have made it clear that they want the certainty of a signed deal.
Thanks for that candid assessment. Looking forward to March and beyond, Gene, what kind of volume should we expect here in Los Angeles?
Philip, over the next several months, we'll continue to see lighter volume, particularly compared to all the records we set in the first half of last year. However, there are still a few bright spots on the horizon. Lunar New Year is behind us, and COVID restrictions in China have now eased considerably. So we should see an uptick in overseas production, and many of those idled container vessels I mentioned earlier are well positioned off the coast of China waiting for cargo. There's also been a recent bump in the number of vessels headed toward the San Pedro Bay. In February, we saw a lull, but current ship activity is moving closer to normal now that factories are back online. Based on our forecasting data, I expect the Port of Los Angeles volume in March to be close to 600,000 TEUs, up more than 20% over February. Finally, it's important that we see a spring agreement between the longshore workers and the Pacific Maritime Association. As I mentioned before, we really need that in order to start bringing cargo back to Los Angeles. In the meantime, we're taking advantage of this cyclical downturn to focus on our data and infrastructure projects, improving efficiency and sharpening our service levels. So when the cargo volume increases, and it will, we'll be ready.
Gene, more than 3,500 participants gathered in Southern California a few weeks ago for the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference. What are your post-TPM thoughts after meeting with such a wide range of leaders?
Philip, it was great to spend time in person with so many customers, partners, and industry friends. My calendar was booked morning, noon, and night to take full advantage of the range of stakeholders that TPM attracts. Here are my key takeaways from this year's event. First, participation by the Federal Maritime Commission Chair Dan Maffei and Commissioner Carl Bentzel was a big plus. The FMC is active on implementation of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, demurrage and detention issues, along with other industry topics. Having FMC leadership on site to provide their perspective and interact with attendees was a great advantage. Second, TPM is typically the place where ocean carriers and importers sign contracts for the coming year. However, from what I've been told, and as reported by Bloomberg's Laura Curtis, not as many deals were finalized at the conference as expected. This is particularly due to importers hoping freight rates will go down even further and general market uncertainty. This delay could wind up being an advantage for West Coast ports. Many cargo owners want to see a labor deal before they bring more volume back here. So if we get a contract soon, those importers will take notice. Finally, the general sentiment I heard at TPM is that global trade will rebound during the second half of this year. While no one predicts a huge spike, the consensus is we'll start to see a pickup in cargo around the mid-year point as we move into a more traditional peak shipping season.
Thank you, Gene. Let's take some questions from the media. Please use the Q&A box below to submit a question, making sure to include your name and affiliation. We've gotten a few questions in advance, so we'll start with those, but feel free to add in the Q&A box. First question is from Deborah Belgum of Women's Wear Daily. What are you hearing about the contract talks between the ILW and the PMA? Are we any closer to a deal?
I don't know that we're any closer, Deborah, but the two sides continue to meet in good faith and hammer through all the issues necessary in this coast-wide as well as the local agreements up and down the 29 West Coast ports. With Labor Secretary Marty Walsh's departure this month and the appointment by President Biden of Julie Su from Deputy Secretary to acting, there will be continuity in this transition. And President Biden has officially nominated Deputy Secretary Su to take on the full-time job. Many of you may remember that Julie was the Secretary for Labor and Workforce Development Agency here in the state of California. She knows both the ILW and PMA very well and understands the port business here on the West Coast. We maintain in regular contact. So there will be continued dialogue and discussion, and with keen and interested parties in Washington led by our Department of Labor. Thanks, Deborah. Appreciate you joining today.
Thank you, Gene. The next question is from Dan Ronan of Transport Topics. Recently, a Southern California truck equipment company announced plans to relocate its manufacturing from China to Mexico. With diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and China rising, do you see more companies looking at this so-called nearshoring as an option? And how will that impact your efforts to attract more business?
Good to hear from you, Dan. And while just about every meeting I go to, companies are talking about reevaluating their supply chains, procurement, and sourcing programs, a lot are talking about nearshoring or onshoring manufacturing, but still, China maintained 57% of all the containers that were imported to the Port of Los Angeles last year. And there's been a slight shift over the past 5 years away from China. Some of the China Plus One strategies that have been invoked, it still remains a powerhouse. The bottom line from where I sit, I don't expect nearshoring to have a significant impact on global trade for the Port of Los Angeles in the near term, but we'll stay very close as always. Thanks, Dan.
This next question is on the same topic from Doug Palmer. It just came in. I believe Doug is from Politico. On this U.S.-China trade front, he's saying that there was a two-way trade set a record in 2023. Do you expect another record in 2023, or have we already reached the peak?
Well, as we've reported in past press conferences, the trade gap between the U.S. and its foreign partners has never been wider. We are continually relying on imports, and we've got to step up our move on exports, manufactured products, agriculture, and others. The reliance on China, as I just mentioned, 57% of all of our imports. That's higher than it was before the trade tariffs and retaliatory tariffs went into place back in 2018. These supply chains have been in place between China and U.S. companies for more than 4 decades. Having lived and worked on the ground in China, been responsible for 26 offices in the private sector, I can tell you those ties are still very strong. And the business people on the ground want to continue to influence commerce flows in both directions. There's no reason that the two largest economies in the world can't trade together. So there's a lot on the policy and political side. I'll leave that to the experts. But for the business folks like us on the ground, this trade continues.
Next question is from Sarah Zimmerman of Supply Chain Dive. Will the merger of the Kansas City Southern and Canadian Pacific affect volumes on the West Coast?
I think it's a little bit too early to see, but the British Columbia ports have done a really good job of improving their market share. And the ability to get in via rail and intermodal services to places like Chicago, Detroit, Memphis, even as deep as Mobile, are great for their growth opportunities. From where we sit here in Los Angeles, this market share decline that I've talked about very publicly has been taking place for over 2 decades. And it's not just the BC ports, but the west coast of Mexico, ports on the east and Gulf Coast of the United States are all chipping away at our market share. Each have hired really switched on leaders aligned with policymakers and continue to pile in investments. We've got to continue to improve every way we can on those areas that folks agree with me on are the most important that we have to focus on. Our cost, our complex labor issues, and not just the ILWU. It's about this massive group of people that work around this port every day. 1 in 9 jobs in Southern California is tied to this port. That's about 1 million paychecks every week that rely on what we do here. And then thirdly, the regulatory environment, whether it be worker issues like Assembly Bill number 5, Senate Bill number 1 on trucks, and the way we go to work every day with respect to air quality and our unbelievable ambitions to get to a zero emission society and port environment. So we've got a lot of work to do. And there's no doubt in my mind that we can grow in a green economy, but we've got to put all these pieces together, and it takes more than just one person. We've got to have alignment with labor, policymakers, and the business community to push this forward. By my count, because of the loss of market share here in Southern California, we're bypassing about 170,000 new jobs per year. And that's direct and indirect. But if you talk to the lady who's getting a paycheck to put food on the table for her kids, she's not going to describe herself as direct or indirect. All of these jobs are extremely important. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, and I spent a lot of time discussing that with others in the California legislature as well as our elected leadership. There'll be more on this to come. Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate you joining as always.
Next question comes from Michael Lev of Chainmail. He says that globally, more than a dozen ultra-large cargo vessels are being introduced that have a capacity of 24,000 TEUs or more. Are these ships too big for the Pacific route and the Port of LA, or will we see them call here?
Michael, to my knowledge, there were more than 500 vessels, or 10% of the worldwide capacity, on the order books at the shipyards. And while some of them will be these ultra-large container vessels, we've already proven that we can handle the largest vessels in the world right here in Los Angeles. The MSC Isabella was the very first call. and its execution of nearly 37,000 TEUs exchanged from that ship is still a world record. But what we'll see is in the TP market, probably between 14 and 16,000 TEU vessels being the workhorse of this particular trade lane. These are traditionally fixed weekly departures and arrivals, and to keep that cadence going back and across the Pacific, you've got to be able to work that vessel, get it turned around and back to Asia. The other piece to this is very interesting. While a lot of observers like to compare Los Angeles to other ports around the world, this is purely a gateway, where nearly the entire ship is discharged upon arrival and then loaded back up in full with exports and empties going back to Asia. Other ports around the world in geographies like Europe, Asia, the Middle East typically have an exchange of 1,500 to 3,000 units on and off before they move to their next port. This is a very unique operational circumstance we have here, yet we've shown that we can handle those largest in business today right here at the Port of LA. Thanks for the question, Michael. Appreciate it.
Doug Palmer from Politico follows up with another question, Gene. He mentions that President Biden recently revived the President's Export Council. What would you like to see the council focus on?
Well, thanks for the question, Doug. And we have been talking about this on the advisory committees that I sit on in Washington, including the Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness for Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. And it was one of the areas that we focused on because a number of reasons. Exports have lagged as the American economy grew over the past several years. According to the U.S. Labor Department, export jobs pay on average more than jobs in other segments. And with 11 million openings right now across the country, we need to train up, reskill, and get onboarded folks that can work in this export industry. And trying to drive domestic production of manufacturing, agriculture products are directly in line with growing this economy. And it's been said by the National Economic Council that when we have trade gaps as large as we do, they become drags on GDP performance. So narrowing that trade gap by elevating the exports is key to America's prosperity. Appreciate the call in, Doug. Thanks.
Next question is from Eric Watkins of Cargomatic. He says that in April, the California Air Resources Board is likely to implement the new Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. While this may be good news for some, it may also be bad for others as the cost of the regulation could drive some small trucking firms out of business. What measures can be taken by ports or other agencies to help ensure that small truckers can meet the financial requirements of this new regulation?
Eric, as always, thanks for joining. And this is a super complex issue, but it cannot be just the ports leading this charge. We need the business sector to amplify our messaging. Now, while we have every aspiration and our resolve has never been greater to get to zero emissions, there are certain nuances here that need attention. For example, tax law. Even with grants, drivers and companies still have to pay income tax on those grants that they receive. And no matter what, the federal excise tax is applied to the full sticker price of a heavy-duty Class 8 truck, regardless of how much money comes in, to help support the difference between the current truck and that newer technology that's coming on the ground from a price perspective. In addition to that, we've got to work with the insurance industry to make sure that we can have excellent coverage, and the deployment of this technology has not been as fast as some would like. Our time needs to be spent around accelerating technology and finding both the investment and funding streams to make it possible. Commercial availability will dictate how important we can move this along. But realistically speaking, when we put in the first clean truck program back in 2006 here at the ports of LA and Long Beach, we ran about a third of the truckers out of business. Not only were the barriers to entry too high, the barriers to stay were too high. So we've got to be really smart about this, working with big thinkers around how best we can deploy the technology and make sure that we're not a jobs killer. This is going to be extremely important. So look forward to the advice of you and so many others as we continue to move forward here. The other piece to this, which is really interesting, is that the ports of LA and Long Beach have collected nearly $60 million in clean truck fees since April 1 of 2022. To this moment, we've appropriated about $1 million applicable to clean truck grants. And when we went out above and beyond that with $6 million of our own money on the ZE25 program, meant to attract zero emissions heavy-duty trucks that could go a minimum of 25 miles outside the port and back to do business, we had only 2 applicants. So the work continues. I was on the phone with a very famous trucker this morning trying to find out how we thread this needle from so far away, get people interested in these grant dollars. At an upcoming Harbor Commission meeting, I will have a motion put out for resolution that we increase the Port of Los Angeles contribution and stack it with HFIB money here in California. I want to go up to $250,000 per unit, and that hopefully will get people even more interested in subscribing to our grant capabilities and getting these newer trucks out on the road. But please remember that for the trucks that we have here licensed to do business at the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, some 20,000 trucks, that represents just 2 weeks worth of annual heavy-duty truck production in North America. And by the aforementioned bill, SB 1, the private sector trucking companies are only compelled to buy new rigs every 800,000 miles or 13 years. We've got to show through a market maker concept that we can be a good customer to the original equipment manufacturers and their tiered suppliers. So as you can see, just from this relatively swift answer, there's a lot of complexity. There are nuances, and it takes folks with a lot of knowledge around this space in policy, environmental science, as well as the business of supply chain on the ground to really get this moving. But Eric, I am super sensitive to the people that are working out here. We've got about half of all our drivers registered to do business that are classified as small business people. And that means to me 5 rigs or less. Many are Gen 0 and Gen 1 Americans trying to build a life for their family, trying to build a business. So this is very important work we're doing on so many levels. We'll keep up with you guys over at Cargomatic and so many others that have an interest in making this a success. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Gene. We've got about 3 questions left in the queue, so if anyone wants to ask, now would be the time. Next question is from Bill Mongaluzzo, Journal of Commerce. Retailers are saying that given the uncertainties in the economy now, it's difficult to project what their import volumes will be this summer. What are carriers telling you about when to expect a recovery in the eastbound Trans-Pacific?
Oh, thanks, Bill. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we start to see a little bit of an uptick in volume in the middle of the year, and then the back half looks a little bit stronger for a couple of reasons. One, we're watching purchase orders very closely, and those purchase orders that go into factories in Asia typically are entered into systems about 90 to 120 days before a vessel departs Asia. So we're getting a pretty decent look right now as to what summertime may be. You'll start seeing fall fashion, summer fashion, Halloween, back-to-school products starting to move through the system. But it's also incumbent upon everybody to get this cargo out of the warehouses that's been sitting now for a couple of years. We're still seeing deep discounts coming across in email and text messages from our favorite retailers across the country. That cargo still has, or the products and the cargo that came in still has to get moved out through the economy. And those deep discounts are done in an effort to clear out warehousing space, which here in Southern California and across the nation, still pretty full. According to the St. Louis Fed, the inventory sales ratio is still 1.37, and while off its all-time highs, still relatively elevated compared to what traditional numbers should look like to replenish inventory as sales go out the front door. So there's a lot of data to evaluate every day, but based on all the signals I'm getting, second half should be better, a little more normal calendar. How much remains to be seen. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate you joining as always.
Following on that question, Gene, Rebecca Moore from Riviera Maritime Media in London is asking, looking at 2023 as a whole, is there a particular challenge and or opportunity that stands out with respect to building trans-Pacific trade?
Now, number one, for us in Los Angeles, we got to bring more cargo back. As I've talked about many times in this setting, we've had cargo leak to the East and Gulf Coast because many importers and exporters have trepidation about these protracted labor negotiations between the ILWU and PMA. Even though they've put out media releases, met with the president, talked regularly with the Secretary of Labor and other cabinet members, that's still not enough to convince the import-export community to keep their cargo here in LA. That's job number one for us. Let's get that contract done, remove that excuse from the table, and focus on those other areas that I've talked about. We've got to have a great labor workforce moving into the future in that next generation, which is why coming up on next Friday, we're going to have our first public display of our new goods movement training campus here at the Port of Los Angeles that the ports of Long Beach and LA are investing in. We've got to continue to move forward on attracting, recruiting, and retaining folks in this supply chain business at all levels and each segment. We've got to keep working on our costs because, Rebecca, if our volume continues to dip, our unit cost skyrockets. That makes us less competitive. And lastly, on that regulatory front, we have got to have an approach that includes folks from the private sector to talk about what the regulatory environment means and what choices come of those regulations. So we've got to be smart. And I'm not advocating we roll back on anything that we believe here in California is for the greater good of our state and citizenry. We've got to have some balance, and we've got to have some facts about where technology is and how we can accelerate it. But all of this really begins and ends with the U.S. economy. 70% of our GDP is built by us, consumers. Now, while February's consumer numbers were down, the retail numbers themselves were down just a little bit. They came off a really hot January. And the consumer continues to be generally resilient even in the face of inflation. Yet inflation dropped again. I think it was for the 8th straight month, annualized at about 6%. Even more telling is that producer and wholesale prices dropped in February when experts thought that they would see increase as well. Now, everybody's still watching the Fed, and with all the news about the banking sector over the past 6-7 days, folks are on edge about interest rates and what their savings mean, how businesses run off of banks that are holding their money. And then lastly, we've just got to come together and continue to move with sharpening our skills here, making sure that we have the infrastructure dollars necessary for investment. I've said before that early days on the infrastructure law, we have seen money go out the door from Washington to red and battleground states. This is where the cargo moves to and from here in Southern California. We've got to get our fair share. I'll be in Washington in about 10 days, knocking on any door I can to make sure folks have the attention in this area and we could drive money here. This is a long-term approach, but bottom line is we need to start seeing some of that funding come here so we can accelerate the projects that we have in our more than $1 billion pipeline. Rebecca, thanks for the question. A lot here, but there's a lot to work on as well. Thanks.
Gene, the final question is from Laura Curtis of Bloomberg. Have you seen any results from your recent calls on government officials to advocate for more infrastructure resources to be allocated to the Port of Los Angeles?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And this is not a transactional business. I've made my position known to cabinet members and the associates in Washington and President Biden's administration, as well as the officials I traveled with to Japan this week on the trade mission. We've got to continue to campaign, and we've got to sharpen our skills, whether it's on our applications, how we're doing the outreach, and what we're showing on that pipeline list of projects to make sure that these are compelling for the federal, state, and local monies to be invested in our port. I think we'll be successful, but there's a lot of work ahead for all of us here at the Port of Los Angeles. Thanks for joining, Laura.
Gene, that concludes the media questions. Back to you for closing thoughts.
Thanks, Philip. In closing, many of you know that advancing environmental strategies and fostering sustainable solutions are top priorities here at the Port of LA. That's why I was asked to join the Clean Energy Trade Mission in Japan this week. The effort was led by California Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis and Dee Dee Myers, Director of Governor Newsom's Office of Business and Economic Development. Our goal was to facilitate connections between public sector agencies and businesses in the clean energy segments. Specifically, we're seeking solutions to climate change through renewable energy and zero-emission technologies. This trade mission aligned perfectly with the Port of LA's global efforts, such as the Green Shipping Corridor initiatives announced just last year with both the ports of Shanghai and Singapore. Reducing emissions in the Trans-Pacific Corridor with cleaner ships will help decarbonize ocean shipping and yield massive reductions in vessel emissions. For this reason, I'm proud to say that while I was in Japan this week, the Port of Los Angeles signed agreements with the ports of Tokyo and Yokohama. We established a comprehensive set of environmental and digital technology initiatives. Japan has been our second largest trading partner for many, many years, and these agreements will chart the course for our collective future. Both ports will partner with us and establish green shipping trade routes. We'll also work on testing and deployment of zero-emission vehicles, explore renewable energy sources, and cooperate on pollution reduction technologies on our marine terminals. Additionally, Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis signed a letter of intent with the Japanese officials to collaborate on policies and programs that focus on investing in infrastructure and decarbonization. The California State Transportation Agency, Air Resources Board, and Energy Commission will work with their Japanese counterparts to deploy more zero-emissions transportation, expand offshore wind projects, and prioritize investments that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In short, we're creating alliances both locally and internationally to advance sustainable technologies along with solutions. I'm so encouraged by the partnerships that we continue to forge and renew. My personal gratitude and appreciation to both Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis and Director Myers for leading this crucial trade mission. Thanks for joining us today. Philip and I look forward to being with you again next month.